Hello everyone, this is Awala. In this video, I'll go over the spinal cord. Let's first compare the spinal cord to the vertebral column. As you can see here, the spinal cord is actually shorter than the vertebral column. It ends between lumbar 1 and lumbar 2 vertebrae. The vertebral column has cervical, thoracic, lumbar, and sacral regions. Also, the spinal cord has the same regions but shorter. For example, here, the cervical region of the spinal cord ends at C6. Remember that we have 7 cervical vertebrae, so it's shorter by 1 vertebra. The thoracic region of the spinal cord ends in between thoracic 8 and thoracic 9 vertebrae, and the lumbar region of the spinal cord ends at T11 vertebra. The sacral region of the spinal cord ends in between lumbar 1 and lumbar 2 vertebrae. So each region of the spinal cord is actually shorter than its respective region of the vertebral column. Here is the spinal cord that ends in between lumbar 1 and lumbar 2 vertebrae. The end of the spinal cord looks like a cone, so we call that end conus medullaris. The spinal cord is lined with the inner meningeal layer, the pia mater. It directly lines the spinal cord or the brain. Then outside of the pia, we have another meningeal layer, the arachnoid mater. There is a space here in between the pia and the arachnoid. This space is called the subarachnoid space, and it has the CSF, which is the cerebrospinal fluid. The very outer meningeal layer is tough, and we call that the dura mater. So from in going out, we have the pia, then arachnoid, and then the dura mater. There is a lower extension from the pia going down to the coccyx that we call filum terminale. This is to fix the spinal cord in place and support the spinal cord. This is a cross section of the spinal cord, and it has white matter superficially. The white matter is made from myelinated axons. So the cell bodies are found here in the center, and then the axons go superficially to make the white matter. And because the myelin sheath is white colored, this is white matter. Then in the center, deeply, we have the gray matter, and the gray matter has cell bodies. There are 3 horns making the gray matter. The posterior horn, and this has sensory cell bodies. The anterior horn, and this has somatic motor cell bodies. Somatic motor means the signal going to the skeletal muscles. So here we have the signals going to the skeletal muscles, so we can control them. They are voluntary. Then the lateral horn is also motor, but we don't control the movement coming from the lateral horn. This is the visceral motor cell bodies. So visceral meaning the viscera is going to move like the stomach, small intestine to move the food downstream, for example. So both the anterior horn and lateral horn are motor, but the anterior horn controls our skeletal muscle, so it has the somatic motor cell bodies. The lateral horn has visceral motor cell bodies. The pathway going to the spinal cord is sensory. Any sensory signal has to stop first here at the posterior root ganglion. Remember, a ganglion means collection of cell bodies outside the central nervous system. And those cell bodies in the posterior root ganglion are sensory cell bodies. From the sensory cell bodies of the posterior root ganglion, the sensory signal goes to the spinal cord through the posterior root. So these axons making the posterior root carry sensory pathway only. So the posterior root is only sensory. Here is the anterior root, and the anterior root takes the signals from the anterior horn and lateral horn going to the skeletal muscles if it is from the anterior horn, or to the viscera if it is from the lateral horn. The anterior root is only motor. Now, both roots, the anterior and the posterior, join to make the spinal nerve. So the spinal nerve has now both sensory and motor signals. It is a mixed nerve. The spinal nerves exit the spinal cord and then go out through the intervertebral foramina. There are 31 pairs of spinal nerves, 8 cervical nerves, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, and 1 coccygeal. How to give the nerve its number? In every region except the cervical, the nerve takes the number of the vertebra above. For example, this nerve here is down to thoracic 1, so this is T1 nerve. How about the nerve here, for example, between lumbar 2 and lumbar 3? It takes the number of the vertebra above, so this is lumbar 2 nerve. How about this one here, down to lumbar 5? So this is lumbar 5 nerve, and so on. In the cervical region, the rule is different because we have 8 cervical nerves, but 7 cervical vertebrae. Now, the nerve in between the skull and C1 is C1 nerve, cervical 1 spinal nerve. So in the cervical region, the nerve takes the number of the vertebra below. Like, for example, this is C2 vertebra and this is C3. The nerve coming in between takes the number of the vertebra down. So this is C3 spinal nerve. How about the one in between C6 and C7 vertebrae? It takes the number of the vertebra below, so this is C7 nerve. How about the nerve in between C7 and thoracic 1? Remember, we have only 7 cervical vertebrae. So after the 7th cervical vertebra, we have the first thoracic. The nerve in between is C8 spinal nerve. So the rule is the nerve takes the number of the vertebra above in every region except cervical. In the cervical region, it takes the number of the vertebra below. But the nerve in between C7 and T1 is the cervical 8 spinal nerve. Now, the precentral gyrus has somatic motor cell bodies. They control our skeletal muscles, and we call them upper motor neuron. The signal from the precentral gyrus goes down through a descending tract to go to the opposite side, anterior horn of the spinal cord. So if this is your left precentral gyrus, the signal from there goes through this descending tract to the right anterior horn of the spinal cord. That's why the left cerebral hemisphere controls the right side of the body, and the right cerebral hemisphere controls the left side of the body. So the cell bodies found in the precentral gyrus are somatic motor, and then their axons get the signal down to the anterior horn. So the neurons coming from the precentral gyrus getting the signal down to the anterior horn are called upper motor neurons. Then the signal exits the anterior horn through the anterior root and then the spinal nerve to go to move our muscles. So the neurons starting from the anterior horn are the lower motor neurons. So the lower motor neurons give the signal from the anterior horn of the spinal cord to our muscles, but the upper motor neurons get the signal from the precentral gyrus to the anterior horn of the spinal cord.